But do go to a shelter, do distribute food, do help someone. If you are seeing an old lady finding difficulty in pushing her trolley, why don't you go and help? And you'll see there's a fulfillment, there's a spiritual fulfillment there. And sometimes God is found there. Because what are you doing by helping someone? You are becoming God-like. You are showing compassion. You are showing service. You are showing the idea of giving. You are showing forgiveness. You are showing love. All of these things which are divine qualities. So I think sustainability of spirituality is practical. Yes, if you are a Sufi, a Kabbalist, either a Christian mystic, you're part of the Rosy Cross, or whichever order, spiritual orders, Knights of Columbus, whatever you may be, you may have a spiritual mantra that you do in the morning, and you may have certain, you could say, liturgies that you're reciting. And yes, that's if you're wanting to go and be initiated into a pathway and you're very serious about union with God and so forth. But for the average person who, okay, may later on in their life want union with God, but at the moment I just want to feel spirituality. I want to feel good. I want to connect with the light. I want to fulfill my duty to God. I would say the best thing is service. The ability to go out there and help someone.
So today we have on the show Imam Sayed Ali Abbas Razawi. He's going to be talking about his own journey to becoming an imam. He's someone that really reflects this concept of the cosmic bridge, as he's big into interfaith dialogue. He's going to be talking around things like the universal soul, divine spark, things that connect all religions, all people. And then he's also going to be talking at the end about some actually tips for relationships and romance, which was interesting as well. So look forward to today's show. Awesome. So yeah, I was referred to Syed by Rabbi Debbie, who we had on a few shows ago. Very interesting conversation. She's very into interfaith dialogue, so has worked with imams, with priests, and suggested Syed come on the show. So I think we were talking about this before when we spoke last week, that Rabbi Debbie has that interesting story that actually she, in the past, thought, how can I believe in God given what's happened with the Holocaust and all these things that happen in humanity? I think when we spoke, you said you don't have a story that's as extreme, but you've also had your own journey as well towards becoming an imam. So yeah, I was wondering if you could share that with us.
Thank you. I think it's not as exciting as Rabbi Debbie's, but well, growing up, I guess, when we did anyway, it's going back a number of years, quite a lot of years back. But there was this kind of push towards atheism when I was growing up. So I remember at the age of probably 11 or 12, thinking to myself, is there really a God? And I went about trying to prove God, intellectually rationalizing God. But I got to the conclusion that however you prove God in your mind, at least for me, I wasn't feeling God in my heart. And so there were a number of questions whilst I was growing up that really panicked me. So you can imagine an 11, 12-year-old, and then all of a sudden it kind of dawns on you. There I'm playing football, and at the age of 11 started playing rugby, cricket and the sun, athletics, and then bang, kind of dawned on me. I thought, we're all going to die one day. What's going to happen then? Is there some kind of a black hole? Is there a life after death? And if there is a life after death, who wants to live forever? Billions of years and billions upon billions of years. And so I remember sitting down having a panic attack one December. And I thought to myself, well, either way doesn't really look appealing to me. Because let's say if there is a heaven, then what do I do? How much can I drink? How much can I eat? And if there's a hell, how much can I burn? So I thought, that's not really appealing. But then at the same time, it's not really appealing either that your eyes close and that's it. It's nothing after that. So in that kind of state of panic, I thought to myself, well, is there a God? Is there not a God? And that kind of developed. 12, 13, 14, 15. Then I got to the age of 16, and I remember my father saying to me, he said, look, I think, and this is completely unrelated, by the way, so he didn't know I was going through this kind of existential crisis. But he said to me, he said, look, why don't you go to pilgrimage? So we'd gone to pilgrimage to Mecca, but he was a great believer in the power of saints. So he said, look, why don't you go and feel the faith? And I was quite hesitant at the time, but I thought, okay, let's do this. So I remember going to my first shrine. I'd been to Medina before that, but in those days it was very difficult to sit next to a shrine or the shrine of the Prophet. But here we are going to the shrine of a saint. And I went, and it was just, I think it was my cousin and myself and my sister. And I remember this kind of extreme pull. And then after that, I felt this presence. And you have this spiritual experience, which I did at the age of 16. And I came to realize actually, God isn't rationalized, God is felt. And then, you hear stories of great mystics. And then after that, I thought to myself, but look, Ghazali had this moment where he pretty much had a breakdown, kind of a Descartes moment, whereby he has this breakdown and then he goes into seclusion for 40 days doing spiritual exercises. And then after that, he comes to realize that actually it's not all rationalizing. There's something which is above and beyond the intellect, because the intellect can describe things and explain things, but there's no unmediated feeling. And because God is not tangible, and in essence, you really can't describe him. If you go deeper and deeper and deeper, what do you get to? Even if you say he's the absolute, even then, this concept of absolute has a restriction, and the restriction is the term absolute. So God is, above and beyond. But the only way I found that you could actually come to know God is through feeling God. And I guess that's where my journey started, from a moment of skepticism. And then after that, from 16 onwards, and I came back to my father and I said, look, forget all of this now. I want to go and become a saint. Well, I want to go into the mystical pathway and everything. And he was like, look, listen, calm down. Finish your GCSEs, which I've been. Let's do your A-levels, go to university, and then perhaps from then onwards you can take a step to what you want to do. So I went to university, but there was never this kind of idea that I wanted to become a cleric. And I guess I went to theological school only because I wanted to know more about God and faith. And perhaps there may be someone there who could teach me something about mysticism. But lo and behold, I didn't really want to become an imam or anything of that nature. I guess that came about by pure coincidence. That I guess, and I think it was in 2006, 2007, happened to be in Bradford of all places at the time. And I went into a mosque and there was no imam there. And somebody came up to me and they said, well, I've heard you've studied quite a bit. Would you like to lead the prayers? Because there's nobody else to lead it. So fine, led the prayers. Then when I went back to the seminary, they said, well, look, now that you've done this, I think you should formally now be initiated, so to speak, in taking this pathway and going forward and becoming an imam, ordained, so to speak. And there you have it. That's the journey. Out of pure coincidence, I thought, actually, maybe I should do. And then the pathway then opens up. But yeah, so it's not as an exciting story as I would say, but I think Rabbi Devi's is much more exciting than mine.
Yeah, quite interesting as well, because obviously Rabbi Devi went to a synagogue in Berlin, which is obviously where the Holocaust happened, right? But it was having that journey there, and you said you went to Mecca, and you had I like what you said around it's like a feeling versus being like rationalized. And I think one of the difficulties, because you can't rationalize God's spirituality, is it's quite difficult to put into words. But for that moment where you're in Mecca and you started feeling God for the first time, is there any way you could put that into words? Like, how would you describe that feeling that you felt in that time in Mecca?
Again, I think it is very difficult. I think those saints who have been able to encapsulate feeling are quite unique. The one that comes to mind immediately is Ibn Arabi. And again, within the Catholic tradition, you have Meister Eckhart, Teresa of Avila, and Tom of the Cross. I've read Maimonides, and in fact, I've got a commentary of the Zohar on my left-hand side. So if reading all of these mystics really puts you in a position whereby you think to yourself, the outer is diverse, it's different, but the inner is all unity. It's the inner is God consciousness. So if I was to borrow from them, how does one describe it? I think it takes you to a level of certainty. Now, again, I'm not claiming to have achieved or maintained or got to this stage of certainty, because had I done that, I probably would be a saint, which I'm not. But I'm not at the level of certainty in that respect. But there is a level of certainty. There's an overflow. There's an overflow of mercy in one's heart. When you start feeling God, You feel love, you feel mercy, you feel compassion, and you feel the presence of God. Presence of God is different from feeling the presence of a person. The presence of God, when it eclipses your heart, fills the heart with light. And it's like a movement of light, which I guess through one's own ego disconnects. But once you felt it, or at least if you felt it once in your life, then you know how it feels. You want to reconnect yourself with that light again. That light which gives a form of expansion of the heart, an expansion of the soul. It's not constricting you in any way. It alleviates any form of spiritual depression. And that light which shows you unity, that everywhere you look, you see the face of God. You see creation as a reflection of the divine, or in essence, as a manifestation of the divine reality. If I could describe it another way, it's like the sun, with the rays of the sun coming. They may have their own independent existence, but the rays always connected to the source. And so I guess when you have this kind of feeling of warmth inside of you and expansion, you see all of creation as interconnected back to the source, that each one of us are dependent on the absolute, but the absolute's independent. And that independency is only with the absolute. So each one of us are all, I guess, on our own spiritual journeys. But I would say at the age of 16, what I felt was this presence of the heart, which illuminates the heart even for a second, makes you feel that there is something there. And it's not just a feeling, I guess, because feelings can be doubted. But when the heart is filled with, I guess, the light of God, even if it is for a second, then you come to realize that, well, actually, there is something, whatever one may call it, he or she, there is something out there. And I guess there's a feeling then that I've got to move towards God. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you all of a sudden start becoming the best human being, but at least that gives you some form of inspiration that I should be moving in the direction of coming to know it. I don't know if that helps.
No, super powerful. I like what you said. Well, a couple of things, your heart being filled with light, and the other thing around like God consciousness, about within whatever our faith is, if we have that faith, it's it's something that unites all of us, and it's the outer stuff, the things we see that are different. You also mentioned a couple of Catholic figures there, and that's my background, Catholicism. And I wanted to ask you, because I think a lot of people like listening to the show, it's quite a diverse audience we have, won't know the relationship of Jesus with Islam. And I know Jesus was actually an important figure in Islam as well. And I know not a lot of people know about that. So I was wondering if you could explain that for anyone listening.
So Jesus plays quite a central role as it goes. Jesus is a prophet within Islam, and Islam reveres prophets. So these are individuals who are a medium between creation and God, in the sense that God speaks to them, and whether through Gabriel or otherwise, you've got the events of the burning bush with Moses. So there are a number of prophets, Israelite prophets, who are extremely important within the Islamic context. And I would say Islam upholds all the prophets of Judaism and Christianity, though obviously Christianity believes in Jesus as the Son of God. But I would say that from a mystical point of view, we can look at Jesus, or the Islamic traditions can, as a manifestation of God. Jesus was able to bring the dead back to life. And this, again, we have stories that it's physical, but also it's a metaphor for bringing the heart back to life. So you do find in North Africa, at least once upon a time, people like Abu Madian, who describes the fact that you can travel spiritually through each prophet. So if a person becomes, so Jesus is known as Isa within the Islamic context. So when you become an Isawi mystic, you're taking the characteristics of Jesus, that love, that compassion, but the ability to revive hearts. And some mystics, at least 1,000 years ago, would claim that they have the ability to bring the dead back to life as well. Like Jesus was able to cure people who are sick. So for Muslims, I guess Jesus is a prophet. There's an entire chapter, by the way, dedicated to the mother of Jesus. And the entire story of Jesus is found within the Quran. Now, not within its entirety, but enough of the story, because remember, Quran is meant to be a book of guidance, so it's not a book of history. It's not a book of law, contrary to what people may think. There are only a fraction of verses which actually deal with Islamic law. The rest of it, you've got to go to the tradition, the prophetic tradition. But the Quran as a book of guidance brings forward the story of Jesus and his mother as a form of guidance for Muslims. So, in essence, Jesus is quite an important figure. He's the last of the major prophets before the coming of the Prophet Muhammad. So when, for example, Muslims talk about prophecy, yes, they may have been prophets in between, but the major prophet who brought down, you could say, what we would call Sahib al-Sharia, so who brought down a Sharia, in essence, who brought down principles, a Sharia is basically principles, was actually Jesus. And prior to that, Moses was the one who brought down these principles. So Jesus does play quite a significant role. And for Muslims, if you look at it, Christianity as a religion for us, it was an offshoot of Judaism. So Jesus came for the Jews. And, for my research at least, the Church of Jerusalem was really a sect, you could say, of Judaism, and then which later on then evolved into what we see as Christianity, flourished into this magnificent religion with 2 billion plus followers in the world.
You mentioned there as well Jesus's mother, the Virgin Mary. There's like a chapter on her. Why is she important in your religion as well?
Well, she's the mother of a prophet. So in the same way that we have the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, Jesus is also a prophet. Now, Muhammad for us brought down the Quran, the completion of the monotheism, which starts off, well, it'd be wrong for me to say starts off with Abraham. Actually, monotheism, I believe, starts off with Adam. But it's the completion of this message that started off with Adam and then went from prophet to prophet. The great prophet Noah, and then after that, prophet to prophet, and then it comes to the great prophet Abraham, and then Isaac, Ishmael for us is a prophet. And then after that, you have Yaqub, Israel, Joseph, Yusuf, and then Moses, and all the other great prophets. And in between, you've got Daniel and David, and Ezekiel, and so forth. But the mother of Jesus is important. Firstly, you've got the virgin birth. But I think if you go even before the virgin birth, Muslims believe in the virgin birth, by the way. But if you go before that, she's the first woman who actually goes into the temple. And in a time where, at least from the history that I've read, that there was a restriction on women, she had her own room. She had the fruits coming down from heaven to sustain her. She was a special person. She's one of the 4 leading women of heaven, or leading women on earth. So the other one being Khadija, wife of the Prophet. You've got the mother of Jesus. You've got, for example, the wife of the Pharaoh, Asiya, was a monotheist. She was killed by the Pharaoh for her support for Moses. So, so in this respect, no, I'd say that the Lady Mary is an extremely important personality within Islam, and she's actually a role model for many women to follow.
Amazing. Yeah, I learned something new there. I actually didn't know that around in terms of like her going to the temple, and women weren't allowed to kind of go to the temple before that. So that's very interesting. I wanted to ask as well. So when we spoke before, I know you know about Carl Jung as well. You read about Carl Jung, and for me, his works are interesting because I've always felt similar to what you discussed here around God consciousness, this inner feeling. It's something that connects us as Muslims, Jews, Christians, people of faith, and he's got that concept of the collective unconscious. And for me, it was a really good way of explaining what we're talking around here. But yeah, what do you think, kind of getting into that a little bit more, how would you describe that feeling in more detail that you were talking about? I think earlier you called it God consciousness, Carl Jung calls it the collective unconscious, but what is this spirit that kind of all of us have in common here?
It's quite an extensive discussion. So, okay, so let's go through, well, what I would think. Let's go through the philosophical and start off. Islam has a tradition, well, 3 different philosophical traditions, which may be important to mention. I guess the first is you've got this Aristotelian tradition, which was prevalent within Spain. But then after that, there's an evolution of this tradition that takes place. in the form of Avicenna, Ibn Sina. So Ibn Sina is not Aristotelian. Ibn Rushd was Averroes was Aristotelian. But then you've got this kind of Neoplatonist. You've got the school of Plotinus, and within the Islamic context, the schools that you could say evolve, especially within the Shia tradition. After that, you've got the school of Mullah Sadra. You've got some of the mystical schools, the Illuminationist school. You've got the integration of Pahlavi philosophy from Iran. If I was to pull all of that together, I would say that in terms of the spirit, or this in terms of a collective spirit, to describe that, I would have to go back to God. So if you take God, if you take the different levels of existence, go back to the very beginning, God is, as we find in a particular tradition, he's a hidden treasure that would love to be known. Here, God in his absolute. There is no manifestation. It's not at the level of manifestation. It's at the level of absolute. And you could talk about it in the sense that it's a black light. Black light in the sense that the dark light or the black light is that when something shines so bright that it actually goes into reverse, it goes into darkness. Darkness in the sense that nobody can perceive God. And at the level of absolute, there are no names of God. Because remember, names, when names come forward, is a restriction, is a limitation. And Islam has maybe 99 names, or in certain prayers you have over 1,001 names. Names are there as a form of a description. And those that pertains back to the absolute. So for example, when we say God is Rahman, Ar-Rahman, most merciful, that merciful has love in it as well. So he's lovingly merciful. That's a quality of God. And because God has no physical face or body for Muslims, if God did have a physical face and body, wouldn't be God, because then it becomes limited. God is then, you could say, dependent upon a body. If there was incarnation of God in human form, then God would be dependent upon a body to incarnate in. So there's no dependency at the level of absolute. If there's dependency, there ceases to be God. At the first level of manifestation, you could say, which we would call it absolute existence. So not existence and absolute. So the only kind of, you could say, limitation there is this concept of absolute. But at that level, you find that the names of God, which all of creation, by the way, are names of God. So if I was to say water, for a mystic and Islamic mystic, there are three names. If they were to look into water, they would see. One is all merciful, lovingly merciful. One, for example, is the name Al-Latif, which means, I would say, it means subtle. And the other one would be Al-Hayy, the name Al-Hayy, which is life-giving. So when all of these three names can come together, it forms water. So long story short, all human beings are a combination of names of God. And this is why when you look at human beings, you can actually come to know God. Third level of manifestation, when everything becomes apparent, this is where you have two things. You have this universal intellect and you have this universal soul. The universal intellect is this archetypal intellect which brings together all of the other intellects, and it contains all of the knowledge of creation. And in the same way, when you look at the soul, the universal soul, in fact, we are this puzzle of this absolute soul, which therefore means that there's a connection between all of us. And this connection then goes back to God, because remember, God creates. And when God, whether he creates physically or whether he creates soul, that moment of creation is when the divine spark goes into, you could say, that creation. So the God DNA is in all of us. God is in all of us in that respect. Each one of us has that divine spark inside of us. At the moment of manifestation, the absolute, when it clicks and the creation is made, that spark is in all of us, that light is in all of us. So God is found deep inside all of us, all of creation, including, the chair that I'm sitting on, including the table. Every single thing in creation, existence itself has that divine spark. Bearing that in mind, existence also then, or a soul also, has that divine spark. So each one of us, regardless of who we are, has that level of God in us. And when this overflow comes, or when you try and connect to God, that soul, that expansion of the soul, that expansion of the human being, it's actually inside of us. That connection to God is inside of us. God is inside of us, and God is inside of all of creation. And this is why I would also go as far as to say that when a person is in tune, then they're in tune with all of creation. And perhaps this is why the Quran says to kill one person, or this is why Islamic tradition says to kill one person, is as if you've killed all souls. Because in effect, that one person is Adam, and the Adamic reality is all of creation. In fact, 8 billion human beings, and then after that, all of creation. Because one would say that the entire universe and all the different components of that universe is found within human beings, or are found within that Adamic archetypal reality. I don't know if I'm answering the question.
Oh, that was a brilliant answer. So there's some terminology again, which I feel like I felt in my heart, which is like the divine spark, the universal soul. You were talking around there, being in tune with that as well. One of the reasons I started this podcast and the concept, the cosmic bridge, is two sides of this. Is maybe quite an obvious one, someone that's become very materialistic, obsessed with material things in life, and they looking to have more of that spiritual aspect. Or on the other side is people who maybe are in quote spiritual because, you know, they're going to a mosque regularly, they're going to church regularly, they're going to synagogue, whatever their faith is, but they're maybe not applying that in their daily life, you know, the lessons from the Quran or the Bible. So a question I have for you with, you know, people you're working with, how do you encourage them to be in tune with that divine spark, in tune with that universal soul, so they're not just reading and intellectualizing God, but they're also living out God in their daily lives?
I think that's also a question for us as well, or at least myself, that how would I do something, get back in tune? Look, I think everybody's in the pursuit of happiness. I'll start off from there. Why do we do what we do? In search of happiness. What do you earn so that you can provide for yourself? Ultimately, sustains you, gives you happiness. You know, why do we read a particular book? Why do we go through certain difficulties, trials, tribulations in our life? In the pursuit of happiness. I would say that every human being wants to be happy. Why do we buy ourselves a car? And if you had the opportunity, why would you buy yourself a Ferrari or a Lamborghini? It gives you happiness. Would you buy a 10-bedroom house? If you don't already have one, then yeah, probably you would do. Why? It gives you happiness if you had the money. And if I was to offer you a private jet, why? It gives you happiness. What about if I was to offer you a bank balance? Yeah. You take that bank balance. Why? Happiness. But eventually you come to realize that the material world doesn't actually make you happy. Because the minute you acquire that Lamborghini, after driving it around for the first 3 hours, you're now content and you want to move on to the next thing. Either that car is a bridge towards something else. Maybe you want to impress that boy or girl. But you realize that either I've impressed them or I haven't impressed them. And if I haven't impressed them, then it's useless to me. And if I have impressed them, once I've got what I wanted, again, there's a hollowness inside. So human beings are made of two things. I would say one, the material, which is the outer, and one, the spiritual, which is the inner. Because we live in a materialistic society, we find that pleasure in society, or at least we seek pleasure from the kind of the channel of materialism. Partying, let's say, spending time with people, all very good things. But the one thing is it's not sustainable. So when we look at material pleasure, it's not sustainable. You find, therefore, that many people are shifting towards spirituality. And you do get a buzz when you go to the mosque, or you go to a synagogue, or you go to a temple, or a gurdwara, or helping somebody. But there's an issue there. It's temporary. How do I find a connection to the light, which is continuous? And that's really what it is. And if you look at it and you see, some people could be the most content and happy people, but they don't have all the material wealth, and they don't have the material luxury. And many a time a person sleeping rough, and I've seen this as well, not in maybe the UK, but you have those mystics who walk around from place to place. You could look at India, you could look at Pakistan as an example, you could look at other parts of the world, Burma, be they Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, whatever they may be, but you find that there's a level of contentment inside of them. And the reason why there's a level of contentment, even though they have nothing, is because they've come to understand the immaterial reality, that there is something far greater than matter that gives you this contentment. When people don't find it in their daily life, and when people do find that it's only temporary when they go to a holy place or a holy site, how do I make this permanent? And for me, at least, that is that connection with the divine. That how does one gain that connection with the divine? So even if you're meditating, let's say, for 5 minutes, where you're focusing inside of yourself and trying to connect yourself with that divine spark. Or you're conscious of yourself, as that famous tradition says, that he who knows himself knows his Lord. And why would you know your Lord if you know yourself? Well, if you're created in the image of God, you have all of the characteristics of God and the names of God, the divine names inside of you. If you come to know yourself and your weaknesses, let's say, if you're focused upon rectifying them and taking yourself back to balance. Because remember, when a person commits a sin or they do something which they feel that is a violation of somebody else, it is because there's an imbalance of the names. So when you begin to balance those divine names inside of yourself, that's when you reach a level of perfection. That's when you find you've understood some reflection of God. The biggest challenge is fighting your ego. And I find many things that we do in life is because of the ego. You may shout at somebody because you feel that you need to do so, but that's the ego speaking. And you may, for example, in the month of Ramadan, you'll see many Muslims in the first couple of days, they're a bit agitated because they're hungry. So you're driving your car and somebody cuts you up. And the minute they cut you up, your first instinct may be to say something, to lift a part of your hand. It could be anything like that. But the fact is that's ego. But as the days go on and you're fasting, and it's almost the fasting breaks you, then you don't have the energy to even reply back to someone. And perhaps that's what God wanted. And I guess the reason why people fast in all different faiths, and the more that you fast, there's a book called the Book of Illumination. In that Book of Illumination, at the back of that book, you'll find that the person writing the book says, well, you've got to fast for 40 days. And I used to think, why? And any Muslim will tell you about 25th or 27th day of fasting, you're broken, basically. In the sense, you don't even want to retaliate. If anybody says something to you, you want to remain quiet. And maybe that's where spirituality lies. The ability to overcome your ego. And I would say the philosophy of fasting really is to break your ego down. Now, why is it important to do so? The best way I can describe the ego is, when a light bulb is about to fuse and there's a shot of light, and then all of a sudden then it fuses. That's when we react, when our ego becomes stronger. What happens? Our ego is short-sighted. It says, look, shouting at somebody, swearing at someone, taking somebody's right immediately is going to give you benefit. And so what happens? The light increases and then there's a downer. What we want is sustainable light so that there's no downer after that. The ego gives you a false impression, I would say, that in doing certain things for yourself, or egotistically that is, there's benefit in that, there's light in that. But actually selfless service is where light is. And I will say to people, look, if you really want to follow faith, there's only two things. I find religion is encapsulated in two things. Your duty to God, pray, for example, and your duty to humanity, selfless service. And this is why you'll notice that across all of our faiths, at least throughout the year, not just in the month of Ramadan, Muslims give sadaqah. Muslims do service. Similarly, you have within the Judaic tradition of mitzvah. I remember a dear friend of mine, a rabbi, who was going through brain surgery, and he said, look, do some kind of mitzvah, at least do some kind of good deed. Go and give, maybe sadaqah in my name, or do something that's going to disbalance that negativity. And, thank God he came out completely fine. 1 in a million chance that he got this particular disease, but he came out and they were thinking that he's going to die. Thank God now that he's back again and he's back with his congregation and so forth. Or for example, when Hindus look at the concept of seva, or the dharmic traditions, to serve people. And I guess the reason why you serve people is to break that ego. So if I was to go back and say spirituality, why is spirituality important? Or what can we do regularly? Look, if I was to say sit in front of a book, read a holy book day and night, people, that's not appealing, that's boring. Or for example, praying the whole day. But if a person, yes, remembers God, prays in terms of their connection, and serves humanity, what you find is that opens you up from the shackles of the ego. And I find that this is one of the ways to bring one back to spirituality, but more so, it gives you inner peace and it makes you happy. And that connection with the light is what makes the person happy. And the first stage of connection with light is to counter that which blocks light, which is the ego.
Well, there's a lot to break down there. So first thing you said, which I really liked, is when I asked the question of, how can we, I guess, be more like permanently spiritual versus we just go to, the mosque at the weekend and then we kind of forget about it during the week. And you said, look at yourself first, which I really like that, like humility of, how can I be better in this sense? And then I also really liked what you're talking around there related to fasting, and you're talking about the pursuit of happiness. And one of the things I was thinking was around, in our lives, we're not always going to be happy. We're always going to go through suffering at some points in our life. And Ramadan and fasting is a good example, right? Like you said, day 27, day 28, you're almost like broken in a way, and in a way you're breaking your ego. And I liked what you said, as see it as the service that you're offering as well. And I think just the last point as well on, you were talking around just reading, verses of the Quran or verses of the Bible all day long isn't going to bring people back to spirituality who aren't maybe spiritual. But what is through service, right? By like leading by example. So do you think that's a good way, younger people can like come back to religion, is through religious leaders and people that are religious, showing their service?
I would say so. I found in COVID, congregations spiked. People from different faiths were tuning into all sorts of congregations. Be it from the Christian faith, so you found Muslims tuning into Christian services. A very close friend of mine is a rabbi. He was telling me that, well, I had Muslims tuning into our services, and likewise, when we were holding services, there were all sorts of random people coming through. And I found people were hungry in that period of crisis. I do find that in moments of confusion, or when the world goes through crisis, for some reason people are more spiritually in tune. But the one thing I found which was really successful in that period of time was the ability for people to come together regardless of caste, culture, race, and come and serve people, come and feed people, come and house homeless people. I remember in the city of Glasgow and the city of Edinburgh, I think we were able to clear at least 100%, at least for that period of time, of people, and bring them over to homeless shelters to feed people. Now, when a youth, for example, when one of our youth, be they Christian, be they Muslim, because we were doing partnerships between Christian, Muslim, when for the first time you notice and you see a person giving food to a person who doesn't have it, and that person taking that food, you can visibly see people's faces shake. It's almost as if that there's something on that person's face. There's a level of humility that comes onto you, a level of service. And I find, and I say this to at least the youth, at least once a week. Okay, not once a week if you can't, once a month. But do go to a shelter, do distribute food, do help someone. If you find that an old woman in let's say Tesco, Sainsbury's, or Lidl, or whatever it is, and I'm not here promoting any chain or supermarket here, all of them have crazy expensive prices in comparison. But if you are seeing an old lady finding difficulty in pushing her trolley, why don't you go and help? And you'll see there's a fulfillment, there's a spiritual fulfillment there. And sometimes God is found there. Because what are you doing by helping someone? You are becoming God-like. You are showing compassion. You are showing service. You are showing the idea of giving. You are showing forgiveness. You are showing love. All of these things which are divine qualities. So I think sustainability of spirituality is practical. Yes, if you are a Sufi, a Kabbalist, either a Christian mystic, you're part of the Rosy Cross, or whichever order, spiritual orders, Knights of Columbus, whatever you may be, you may have a spiritual mantra that you do in the morning, and you may have certain, you could say, liturgies that you're reciting. And yes, that's if you're wanting to go and be initiated into a pathway, and you're very serious about union with God and so forth. But for the average person who, okay, may later on in their life want union with God, but at the moment, I just want to feel spirituality. I want to feel good. I want to connect with the light. I want to fulfill my duty to God. I would say the best thing is service. The ability to go out there and help someone. This is what Jesus did. If you look at Jesus' life, yes, Jesus may be famous for worshipping and supplicating and so forth, but what do people really remember? The average person remembers love, because he was able to give love. If you look at Moses, what encapsulates the life of Moses? his service to his community, his nation, emancipating them from slavery. And slavery is not just physical slavery. Slavery is slavery of the mind. Slavery is slavery of the ego. Right? Slavery, a person can be enslaved because of their own ego, because of themselves. If you look at the Prophet Muhammad, what's he famous for, at least within Muslim traditions? He's famous for freeing slaves. He's famous for helping those people who are oppressed. He's famous for empowering women. We're in a time where tribes were burying their daughters alive, and he empowers his own daughter. He works for his wife in a time where men wouldn't work for their wife. He's happy to be married to one woman in an Arabia where women were married, a dozen to one. So in a period such as that, you find the Prophet Muhammad changing norms of a society. And again, you can't radically go 180, because if you were to, people would kill you or not listen to you. But here he was putting a form of, or a mechanism in place for there to be emancipation of women, which there was in the Islamic world, where women had the ability to vote even before Europe did. Where, for example, women were leading their own businesses and caravans and trades and so forth. But the most important thing is that if you look at these great people, look at Abraham and so forth, their commitment to selfless service and humanity is what defines them. Yes, I could be a hermit, worshipping God 24 hours a day. But where the impact is, where I find that there's an increase in spirituality and increase in the light, is when I'm there serving people, helping people. And this, again, is regardless of race, religion, culture, and creed. If we say that people are the children of God, if 8 billion human beings are a reflection of God, they shouldn't be defined by their culture or their religion or their color or their language. In essence, we have a responsibility to help all people. And I think that's what for me spirituality is. That's what for me religion is. That for me is what God wants us to be. Not people who only serve our own kind. That's racism. That's prejudice. God created everyone.
Yeah.
And God differentiate. God is still giving you oxygen, he's giving me oxygen. God gives me sustenance, he's giving you sustenance, regardless of what religion we have. So if a person wants to really acquire spirituality, which is in essence becoming more God-like, then we've got to learn to reprogram ourselves and remove some of that prejudice. And by removing some, you see humanity in people. But anyhow, let me pause it back.
We're all God's children, and I like one of the things you said around like not just literal slavery, but like slavery of our own minds, and it made me think of Carl Jung's concepts around the shadow and like our own inner darkness. And I liked your response earlier, like starting with yourself to one of the questions. So how do you think we can become more self-aware, right, of our own like slavery of the mind, our shadow, as Jung would call it?
I would say there are two concepts within Islam which they call muraqaba and muhasaba. Muraqaba in many ways is meditation. When a person meditates, I find, in particular for prolonged periods of time, you tend to become more aware of yourself. But developing on for meditation, because again, this is not a discussion of meditation, or methods of meditation. The other thing is, muraqaba is the idea of becoming conscious of your actions. We say that the reason why God's given time, or one of the reasons why, is to allow you to pause and to think before you enact. Before you say something, pause. Think. When you're angry, before you take a step, pause. Think. Use your mind. And then take a step forward. So I would say for one to be more aware requires them to use this time to slow down, to breathe, to be more aware of one's actions. How am I coming across to a person? Am I just nagging them? But I mean well for them. I want my son or daughter to succeed in their GCSEs. But if every day I'm saying to them, revise, 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 am I putting a burden on them? And meanwhile, take a step back, put yourself in their shoes, empathize. Now, what should I be doing? Think of a different strategy. So I think many a time our engagement interactions with people is one of the best ways of actually coming to know oneself. More than that, I would say, is relationships, marriages, relationships, partnerships. This is where you come to know yourself even more, because you take your partner for granted many a time. You would be very polite with a person you met for the first time. You probably would smile at them, shake their hand. But that same level of politeness and niceties are not there when you walk into your home sometimes. You're more freer, you're more open. Sometimes you easily violate the rights of people. You may hurt their emotions and their feelings. In particular, people who are very close to you. So I would say it's important for you to be conscious, and the way that you come to know yourself is by your dealings with other people. That's the first thing. The other thing is in terms of muhasabah that we said. Muhasabah really comes down to taking account of your own self. Many mystics, what they do is every night when they sit down, even if they have a pad, they write on that pad for even if it's 5 minutes. What did I do good in the daytime? What did I do bad in the daytime? Don't lie to yourself. Don't cheat to yourself. Be very blunt. Lying to yourself, look, you can lying is a bad thing, by the way, disclaimer. But lying to yourself is one thing. Lying to other people may be one thing. Don't ever lie to yourself. Because when you lie to yourself, you put yourself in a false illusion. You're not doing yourself any favors. Your growth is curtailed. So if you have been a naughty person, naughty boy or girl, write it down. I didn't do this well. I showed anger there when I shouldn't have done. And if you were to do this over a period of 40 days, because every night you've got to face yourself when you write it down. So you're embarrassed. Why did I do this? Why didn't I do this? You see, you start becoming a better person. You start becoming more conscious of your actions and your deeds, how you make people feel. But I guess all of it comes down to this. Meditate, take a deep breath, take a step back. Before you say something, think about what you're saying. Before you lift a hand up, think about, why am I doing this? And okay, you may not have all the time in the world to philosophize every action, but you do have enough time to understand the consequences of your actions. And I think that is important. And slowly, slowly, it becomes a part of your nature, such that you will then naturally, subconsciously, be vigilant of people's rights and of people's feelings and their emotions from a place of love.
I really like what you said, and I think that's a good actionable takeaway from this podcast around writing down at the end of the day, things you could have done differently, things that went well for you. And I think there's this topic of journaling that's quite trendy at the moment, but I feel like that's a very constructive way of analyzing your day. Another thing I thought was interesting was around saying, often it's the people like we're in a relationship with, or our families, that we often don't treat well, right? Versus strangers. So I thought one last question I wanted to ask you, because something I learned in this podcast I didn't know around, Muhammad was very dedicated to his wife. I guess in those situations, how can we be better partners, right, when we're in relationships? And I guess also, what does the Quran say about that?
So there's three things that define a marriage, at least within the Quranic context. If you look at the verse of the Quran, God says that from one of his signs, and it's interesting because linguistically, he may say my sign, our signs, but when he says his signs, third person, that he goes back to the essence. So I interpret from that the closest thing that we have to understanding God is this sign of marriage. So here the verse talks about one soul. From one soul you have two, which are divided, right? So you've got your partner, which is divided from that. And the three things that come. Mawadda, which is love, right? But in Arabic, there are multiple different terms for love. It's not just one. Here, this love is active love. One of the things is that show actively that you love your partner. So what I think one of the things that the Prophet did was actively show his love. it's not sufficient that you buy your spouse a BMW or a Mercedes, and then after that, 10 years later, you say, remember, I bought you something. No, active love, there has to be a level of romance. Active romance is what, meaning what? On a weekly basis, on a daily basis, even if it's a rose on a weekly basis. And, we all fall short. But you've got to keep the spark alive. Dinner dates, rose, something nice, kind words, poetry, whatever it may be. But the Quranic idea of mawadda is an active form of love, to physically demonstrate, not just to keep it in your heart, to physically demonstrate it. People say, but I love you. Don't express it then. So the expression of love is important. The other two things that the Quran talks about is rahmah, which is mercy. Marriage is meant to be a mercy. To show mercy to somebody, to show kindness to somebody, even when you're going through difficulty, but you've been told when you come into the house to put that baggage outside. Don't bring it inside. Many times what you see is people have had a really rough day, and immediately they're snappy and they take it out on their spouse, they take it out on their children, they take it out on their partners. Leave your baggage outside when you walk in through the door, right? And come in with compassion, with love. The other thing a marriage is meant to do, the final third thing, is to take a person to this ontological peace of the heart. How does one achieve that peace of the heart in a marriage? And I guess the only way is if you refine your character in that marriage. You find, if you're living by yourself, you don't know that you can snap easily. When you're married, you know that you can snap. When you're in a relationship, you can snap easily. When you're living with somebody, you can snap easily. Identify it, rectify it. How do you rectify it? Whenever you see negativity, become more proactive in showing love and compassion. And I do find when you're angry, okay, you're angry now, do the reverse. Make your partner a cup of tea, let's say if they like a cup of tea, for example. Do something nice, go for a walk. Argument is taking place, go quiet. Let's go for a walk. Change the scenery. Be proactive. But I guess the most important thing you notice with the Prophet Muhammad, this idea of love continuously. He was married to the lady Khadija for 25 years. One woman in an Arab climate, which was really seen as you'd be less of a man if you only had one wife. And people may say, well, afterwards, then after Khadija died, he had multiple wives. No, all of those wives were either those women who were widowed and nobody wanted to marry, widowed in terms of war, or they were divorced. And in the Arab climate in those days, people didn't want to marry divorcee. Women who couldn't have children. Or, for example, women who were left to the side where fathers came and said, please marry our daughters. So, and his marriages only take place in Medina in the last, you could say, 9 years of his life. But that big period of his life where he was married to Khadija, who was his only wife, and the one who he loved, you notice that even those women he may have married afterwards, and again, to give them food and to give them shelter and so forth, you saw that there was a level of compassion there. There was a level of love there. This idea that even if a wife was angry at him, chucked a plate at him, let's say, still be quiet. He would still be showing love. He would still be addressing them by names of love. And that's difficult, I guess, to combat your ego, especially when, you're in an argument. I'm right and no, you're right and she's right and he's right, and you want to get one up on your partner. That's never the case, because getting one up on somebody is, just remember, if you need to prove that you're right, and if you need to prove, that only has a detrimental effect on the other person. You may beat a person to submission, not physically, but with words. You may push somebody to submission, but that's not a positive thing. So if you see yourself as a godly human being, or a person who's a good human being, I would say, in particular when it comes to partnerships, listen more, be actively involved in conveying that love and compassion, and I guess know that you're going to make mistakes. Learn from them. Nobody's perfect. Don't beat yourself up. Learn from your own mistakes. No harm in saying sorry. I made a mistake, I apologize. Let's get over it. Or let's work to get over it. So yeah, so those are a couple of things.
That's some great advice, and I liked about the counteracting the anger, like making a cup of tea or going for a walk. I thought that was great. Just wanted to thank you for your time. Thank you for coming on, and then also thank you for your service. And I feel like the interfaith dialogue, building bridges, which you're doing is all great. So thanks a lot for all the work you're doing as well.
Thank you. And you're doing some wonderful work with your podcast.
Appreciate it. Really fascinating show today. The first Imam we've had on. I personally took a lot away. It's difficult to do takeaways on this one, but I'm just going to go for one, which was the thing at the end around at the end of every day, when you're doing journaling, whatever you want to call it, writing down things, do an assessment of yourself. What are some things you think you can improve on? What are some things that went well? And it's a good journey of self-reflection. And if you do that every day, as the Imam said, if you do that for 40 days, you're going to learn a lot about yourself, and you're going to become a better person and become a lot more self-aware. If there's anyone you think should listen to this show, please share the podcast links with them. Please subscribe to us across podcast platforms, and please subscribe to us on YouTube, and look forward to seeing you all next week.